Hey everyone, happy Monday, and guess what? We are finally starting a new chapter. We are moving on to Chapter 2, Understanding Healthcare Safety and Infection Control Procedures. And this is probably the most relevant topic of our time right now, considering we are still in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. And so understanding infection control and transmission of disease is very important. And if you go on to work in a healthcare field later on, it is also very important to understand all of those measures of safety and precaution that you have to take regarding infection control. So the first objective that we're going to be talking about is Objective 2.01, Understanding Communicable Disease, which just means infectious disease or diseases that can be transmitted from person to person. The pathology, which is basically the study of that disease and everything about that disease. Treatment, and then prevention methods. So we're going to be talking about infectious disease a lot and how we transmit diseases, how there is a chain of infection, how we can break the chain of infection. And we're going to be tying in some information about COVID-19 throughout this lesson, which is new for this year. We had to add that in because it is relevant to what we're talking about. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is infection. Infection is basically when there is an invasion of the body by some type of microorganism or pathogen. Invading microorganisms use the host or the body's resources in order to multiply and spread disease. Disease typically interferes with our normal function of our body, causing us to feel sick or ill. And it's the third leading cause of death in the U.S. is some type of infection. There are different types of infection. We have local infections and systemic infections. Local infections are things that only a specific portion of the body is infected, such as feeling pain in one area of the body, seeing redness in one area of the body. Maybe you can feel or palpate for heat if there's some swelling or bruising occurring, and then any type of foul-smelling drainage. So an example of a local infection would be an eye infection. It's only infecting the area of the eye. And so you might see some swelling or redness around the eye, and maybe it's very painful to the touch. So basically, when any infection is affecting only one part of the body, that is considered local. Blepharitis is blepher meaning eyelid and itis meaning inflammation. So that's just inflammation of an eyelid, and that would be another example of a local infection. Next, we have systemic infections, and systemic infections affect the entire body. This is when an infection has progressed beyond the point of just one area of the body and has entered the bloodstream or the bone marrow and is now spread throughout the entire body, causing a full body reaction. Systemic infections can include things like fever, aches, chills, nausea, vomiting, and weakness. So think of the flu. When you get the flu, that is a virus that has invaded the body and has affected your entire being. That is an example of the systemic infection. We also have endogenous versus exogenous infections. Endo means inside, and genus means the type or kind. So an endogenous infection would be a disease that originates from within the body. An example of this is when residential bacterium E. coli of the GI tract then enters into the urinary tract. The E. coli bacteria is something that we naturally have inside of our bodies within our gastrointestinal system. However, if that E. coli bacteria travels to another part of the body, such as the urinary tract, this can cause things like a urinary tract infection. It's not something that you caught from outside in the environment. It's something that originated from within yourself. And then we have exogenous, which is the opposite of this. Exo meaning outside. And this is a type of kind or of infection or disease that originates from outside the body. So things like getting diarrhea from eating contaminated food would be an example of exogenous. You ate food from the environment, it went into your body, it was carrying some kind of pathogen, and now you are sick. We also have another category called nosocomial infections. And nosocomial infections are infections that are usually healthcare associated or hospital acquired, meaning they were transmitted by the healthcare worker, or you got this infection while you were inside of a medical facility. An example, a very common example, is ventilator-associated pneumonia. When you are put on a ventilator, your lungs are not able to function on their own, and the machine is breathing for you. And different aspects like humidity and liquid and all of these different things can kind of sit in this thoracic area and cause pneumonia. Now, you didn't get pneumonia from the environment outside because you've been in the hospital, but you got pneumonia because you were on a ventilator. And so that would be another example of a hospital-acquired infection. MRSA is another really common hospital-acquired infection, as well as C. diff. So nosocomial just means something that you were transmitted in the hospital or by a healthcare worker. When we're talking about types of infections, we also have to look at the opportunistic infections. Opportunistic infections are infections that occur when the body's defenses are weakened. So if you already have a weakened immune system because you're sick from something else, or maybe you have an autoimmune condition, then other types of infections say, hey, that person already has a weakened immune system and it's going to be much easier for me to get in there and infect them. Examples of this would be yeast infections or pneumonia. Now let's talk about the different classes of microorganisms. Classes of microorganisms include two main categories, non-pathogenic and pathogenic. Non-pathogenic microorganisms are your normal, non-disease producing organisms that live within our bodies that are beneficial. They do not produce any type of disease, but they just provide natural sources of life and function that are required in order to live. Pathogenic microorganisms are the ones that we're commonly talking about when we talk about causing infection and disease. They may be non-pathogenic in one part of the body or one body system, and then pathogenic in another. For example, E. coli, like we talked about earlier. E. coli is located in the gastrointestinal tract and is non-pathogenic there, causes no issues for us. But when it travels to another part of the body, it becomes pathogenic and causes a type of infection. Aerobic versus anaerobic are probably words you're familiar with if you've ever taken a biology class. Aerobic microorganisms require oxygen to live versus anaerobic that do not require oxygen to live. And then as we go further into classes of microorganisms, we have to look at the shapes, the sizes, and what they cause to happen. And these are things like bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa, so on and so forth. So let's look at each of these. Bacteria are often considered the cause of disease. Certain types of bacteria produce antibiotics. They live in the body without any problems, and they live on the roots of certain plants, converting nitrogen into a usable form. They also help break down dead organic matter. They are classified by shape and arrangement, and typically, if you have a bacterial infection, it is treated with antibiotics. There are many different types of shapes and sizes of bacteria. The first one is cocci, and this is round in shape. Streptococcal pharyngitis or staphylococcal meningitis would be an example of a round-shaped bacteria. So if you see cocci or cocci in a word, then you know that it's some type of bacteria and that it is round in shape. Next, we have bacilli. Bacilli are more of a rod-shaped. Things like E. coli would be an example of a bacilli. And then spirilla are spiral or corkscrew in shape. An example of a bacteria that is that shape is Lyme disease. So again, when you look at the word of a bacteria or the name of a disease, you might be able to figure out if it's a bacterial infection, if it's a virus, if it's protozoa, and what shape it is if it is a bacterial infection. Some bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics, and this is very difficult to cure because eventually, if you continue taking the same antibiotic or using the same antibiotic to treat an infection, it's going to build up a resistance, and then it's no longer going to react to that antibiotic, and it's going to continue to spread. Things like MRSA and MDSA are two very common bacterial infections that tend to develop resistance to antibiotics, so we're constantly having to come out with new drugs to treat those. If you're someone who gets lots of MRSA infections, it can be very, very difficult to treat them because your body has already built up a resistance to many types of drugs. Next, we have the protozoa class. Protozoas are things like malaria and leishmania, I think that's how you say it. And protozoa are one-celled animal-like organisms which contain a nucleus and other defined organelles similar to other animals. Next, we have fungi. Fungi is the red, itchy rash that you get in certain parts of the body. Sometimes this will be on the foot or underneath the breast tissue or any areas that tend to rub together. And they also are things like ringworm. So athlete's foot, jock itch, or ringworm are all examples of fungi. Next, we have rickettsia. Rickettsia is a vector-borne illness. It is rod-shaped, parasitic bacteria that live in the tissues of ticks, fleas, and lice and are typically transmitted to humans through bites. An example of this would be Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Here is a little slide all about Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So it's like, you go out and you get a tick on you, and not all ticks carry Rocky Mountain fever. It also depends on really where you live, in what area of the country you live. If you live up in the mountains, you're going to see more of this. Around here, we don't see as much of it. So if you have a rash in certain areas of the body, you typically can check for the palms and the soles of your feet. A type of the year is spring and summer is when they're very common. And the usual antibiotics that kill most bugs don't really affect Rocky Mountain spotted fever, so they have to give you special medication. And of course, you have a fever. Continuing on, we're going to look at viruses, which is another one you're probably most interested in or have heard about before. A virus is a very small infectious agent that requires a host for survival. Unlike many other types of microorganisms, viruses cannot live without a host. There are over 5,000 different types of viruses, and in combination in multiple ways can produce a wider range of diseases than are even known. They also produce immune response in humans, so oftentimes we use antiviral drugs to create, or we use viruses to create antiviral drugs, and we also use viruses to create vaccines. Again, we treat viruses with antiviral drugs. In some cases, you cannot really treat the virus, but more you just have to treat the symptoms and wait for the virus to run its course. But there are some antiviral drugs, depending on the severity of the illness, that can be used. An example of a virus would be things like HIV, which is human immunodeficiency virus, influenza, or the common flu, hepatitis, and of course, COVID-19. And then we also have another class called helminths. And helminths, first of all, is a very hard word to say, but these are things that typically mean worm. So parasitic worm-like organisms such as tapeworm or pinworm. They infect a range of hosts, including humans and animals, and infection can cause physical, nutritional, and cognitive impairment in young developing children. Helminths are one of the leading causes of morbidity or death in the developing world, with over 2 billion people affected. That's almost 1/3 of the world's population, which are infected with helminths and do not have access to treat them and eventually lead to death. Let's talk about the mode of transmission for these diseases and infections. You have direct contact, indirect contact, airborne, and vector-borne. Direct contact means person to person, which is usually through some type of physical or sexual touch. Animal to person can also be included in direct contact, and it can also be considered mother to unborn child. Indirect contact, or when pathogens are passed along an inanimate object in the environment, things like doorknobs, pins, cell phones, the phone on the wall, this cup, things that you would touch and someone else comes behind you and touches. Indirect contact, we talk about things called fomites, and fomites are just those objects that are causing the mode of transmission. Airborne are pathogens that are carried through the air. They typically cling to the surroundings and then spread, and these are things like SARS, TB, and COVID-19. We know that COVID-19 is an airborne disease, which is why we are stressing the importance of wearing face masks to cover any droplets or anything that comes out of our nose or our mouth. Droplet airborne precautions include things like social distancing, wearing masks, wearing personal protective equipment, This slide just shows you an image of what it might look like depending on the size of the droplet or the particle in the air and to how far it can travel. And then lastly, we have vector-borne. Vector-borne is things that are carried by insects from host to host. So things like, not just insects, but also rodents or small animals. So things like ticks, mosquitoes, rabies is carried typically from an animal to a person. These are all things that are vector-borne illnesses. Here is just another slide kind of explaining some different vector-borne diseases and where they might originate from. And now we're going to watch this video. Now we are going to watch this video all about the mode of transmission regarding COVID-19. Okay, so that quick video was just showing you what can start a chain of infection. Someone sneezes into their hand, they touch a doorknob, you touch that doorknob, you touch the elevator, the next person touches the elevator button, so on and so forth. And simple things like covering our mouth and using a tissue and washing our hands can prevent all of that from happening. Now, not in all cases, but specifically that video was about COVID-19 and just about airborne or indirect infection control. And so hopefully that kind of enlightened you to the chain of infection and what that can look like. So here is an actual image of the chain of infection. So it starts with the infectious agent. So here is the image of the chain of infection. There are multiple different chains and they're all interlinked together. And when you break one link, then you're able to break the cycle of that chain of infection. You have a susceptible host, someone who is hosting or housing the infection. Then it moves to the infectious agent itself. It goes into a reservoir, which is basically where it's being housed in the body, or where it is living until it finds a portal of entry. And then that portal of entry is where it actually enters into the body, either through the air, through a cut, through something you touched. Then you have the mode of transmission. How is it being transmitted throughout the body and to the next person? Then it finds its portal of exit, its way to escape, either through the mouth when we sneeze or by our blood or something that we touch. And then it goes to the next host, and the chain just continues to cycle. So the causative agent is the pathogen or the germ that actually causes the disease, the bacteria, the virus, etc. The reservoir includes the place within the environment where the pathogen is living, and this can include things like people, animals, insects, medical equipment, soil, water, food, etc. Pretty much anything you can think of could be considered a reservoir for infectious disease. Portal of exit is the way that the infectious agent leaves that reservoir through open wounds, aerosols, splatter of body fluids, including things like coughing, sneezing, and saliva. And the mode of transmission is the way that the infectious agent can be passed on. This can be either through direct or indirect contact, ingestion, or inhalation, breathing in something. The portal of entry is the way that the infectious agent enters a new host. This could be through broken skin, like a cut or a scrape. In the respiratory tract is something that you breathe in, mucous membranes, catheters, and tubes, etc. And a susceptible host could be any person, the most vulnerable of whom are receiving healthcare, are either immunocompromised or have invasive medical devices, including PICC lines, devices, or airway attachments that they use. Hand washing is the most effective way to prevent the transmission of disease. Hands that look clean can still have gross germs on them, and you're actually going to be learning about what the differences between hygienic and cleanliness are. So a few basic steps are, of course, to wet your hands, to get the soap, to scrub, to rinse, and to dry. But we're actually going to be learning tomorrow the proper hand washing skill technique that is used in healthcare. And also, if you were to go on and become a CNA, this is the hand washing skill that you would have to complete in order to become a CNA. There are actual steps that are approved by healthcare facilities in order to make sure you are hand washing your hands effectively. So we're going to learn about that tomorrow. That is it for infection control part 1. I believe on Wednesday we're going to be learning about regulatory agencies, and then we're going to continue on over the next couple weeks learning about other safety and environmental control factors that relate to healthcare and infection safety. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me on Remind or email. Make sure that you complete your daily assignments and that you're logging on to Canvas every day between 12:30 and 1:30 to be counted as present. If you have any questions, let me know, and have a great day, guys. Bye.